I want to talk to you for a few minutes today about Ayn Rand. Sometimes people call her Ayn Rand. You can look up a timeline anywhere and just see when she was born and when she died and the events that happened in her life and the books that she published. She's one of the most influential 20th century thinkers. In fact, in my new great book set that just came in a few months ago, I really was surprised they included some 20th century authors. I was surprised that she wasn't included. Now, that may be because they only went to about the 50s on those new 20th century writings and they just, you know, couldn't see where her writings would go. But she helped shape a lot of people's thinking in the second half of the 20th century, especially in the United States and in the West. And it's fascinating that she did that because she came from the East. She renamed herself. I was trying to find in here exactly what her birth name was, and I can't remember, but I'm sure that's on Wikipedia. She was born in Russia, and she was born at a really turbulent time with Stalin and all of the mayhem and mess that was going on in his reign. She knew when she was young that she wanted out. She was always different. She was always very smart. And she was almost came to feel like she was most valued for her intelligence, even as a child. And when the opportunity came for her to leave Russia, it was supposed to be that she was visiting family. I have not read this book in a few years. The definitive source that I'm going to post for you is The Passion of Ayn Rand by Barbara Brandon. And I'll say something about that in just a minute. But she had been hoping, and I can't remember all the details of how she got out of Russia, but she was hoping to get out. She planned to get out, and she felt that she already felt the call to write about her experiences there. She already knew how wrong everything was that was happening in Russia. She already was beginning to form some of her ideas that would become more concrete later on about what government should do and what a thriving economy should look like and what those undergirding principles were. But the opportunity came to visit some family, and she got out on a visiting visa, I think it was, and I think she's the only one in her family that ever got out. She eventually did make a trip back, and I think she saw one sister, or maybe she never made a trip back and her sister came to the States. It didn't go super fantastic. It was fine. She never really felt super bonded to her family or really close to them. But before I go on with her story, I want to make a comment about this source that I'm referencing because I have read other things about her online and short biographies on her and timelines and things like that, and I also have read several of her writings. And you might be tempted to say, well, Barbara Brandon was the wife of the man she had the affair with. So why would you be trusting Barbara Brandon to tell the story of Ayn Rand? Well, first of all, her research and the facts and information that she states can be found a lot of places. She sticks to the facts. She was one of the only few people that were ever genuinely very close to her. And she saw the unraveling of Rand's life firsthand. She was there. And she has a different spin and perspective on everything that happened with her. And she has some real explanations that really resonated with me because they're the kinds of explanations I would make for the kind of behaviors that Rand became involved in later on. But she is a woman scorned in that sense. On the other hand, she's not. There's a couple really interesting things you should know about Barbara before you write off this book and say that it doesn't hold value and that there's not a lot we can learn about Rand from it. One thing is that she loved everything that Rand taught. that she adhered to that philosophy religiously, which is probably the reason why the whole affair happened and she was able to get away with what she got away with. Because Barbara believed in her so implicitly and believed in her theories and her principles. And even 20, 30 years afterward, she was still on panels. You can find, I'll see if I can find some for you that I can link for you, where actually Nathaniel and Barbara were on panels together promoting Objectivism, which is what she titled her worldview, explaining it, teaching it, still adherence to most of what Rand taught. So she isn't a woman that just rejected Rand because she was upset about some of the things that Ayn Rand did. She still saw how valuable everything that she taught was. She still believed in most of what she taught and still told others about it and defended Rand as a person. And she does. I just felt like she did a fabulous job of pointing out, here's where she was weak and that's where her weaknesses took her, and here's where she was strong and that's why she had massive influence. Another reason why Barbara is more of a reputable source now, again, you might feel like this is tongue-in-cheek, and of course this is Barbara telling the story, so why are we going to believe her? But Barbara claims, she says in the book several times, that she was never really attracted to Nathaniel, and that he was probably more attracted to her and in love with her than she was with him. And maybe that's a way of justifying all her, anger and hurt. But she just says that they kind of married for the reasons that Rand claims that people should marry, and that they should be in love and that they should have sexual relations. And so she bought into that and she married Nathaniel because it was the natural thing to do, because they found Rand together and worked with her together. Now, there's a movie made from this book. It's really explicit. I would not watch it. It is pretty specific. It doesn't go into a lot of her older history. It really focuses on that time frame with Barbara when things were really unraveling, and it's sensational and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I couldn't get through it. When it really got sexually explicit, I just turned it off. But there is a book about it. So that's the reason why I still value this book. It's a reason why I still feel like, especially if you're a libertarian, if you love objectivism, if you're really into economics or Austrian school, if you really love any of her novels. I did some research and found out that at one point on college campuses, I think it was Atlas Shrugged that was the most read novel. So even though it's big and fat, that didn't scare college students. They ate it up. And the libertarian movement has come out of that. She's been a big proponent. To my understanding, she never backed the libertarian movement. That's not what I'm meaning. What I mean is that the principles that she promoted have been embraced by the libertarian movement. So she's in Russia, she gets out, she comes to the United States. I think she starts out in New York, she ends up in California. She's writing screenplays, she has some success, she writes a play, has some success, meets her husband who's an actor. She felt like he was the perfect figure of a man, like that he represented complete manhood. And she was very much about manhood and womanhood, and those kinds of roles, and that women should be complete women and men should be men and all that kind of stuff. And she really loved him, and they had a good relationship. At first they had a ranch in California, and her husband really, really loved it, and Frank. And he would garden, and he did stuff with flowers and things like that, and he absolutely loved it there, and didn't want to leave. But then she ended up back in New York. They went to New York, I think they're because there were publishers there, but she wanted to live there. And their story, Frank was a very passive individual, and Rand was a very she was very, very driven. She was passionate, but she wouldn't admit that she might say she was passionate about her writing, or passionate about goodness, or passionate about principles. But one of probably the core principle in Rand's life was the validity of reason. For her, reason trumped everything. If you could reason something out and come to logical conclusions, then that was what was right and true, and that's how you would know what was true. The problem was that for Rand, she was so brilliant. I mean, brilliant beyond brilliant. There's this one time when Barbara was there and this theologian came to see her, and this professor, they discussed metaphysics. He was a Platonist, Ayn and Aristotelian. Now what that means is that this professor was a follower of Plato, and for Plato, revelation and revelation trumped reason, I guess is how you could say it. He was a believer in God and a believer in the metaphysical nature of natural law and its and the necessity of adhering to that, and it's kind of hard to describe. But then Aristotle was a reasoner. If you've ever read the book Please Understand Me, I would say that Plato was an idealist and Aristotle was a rational. Rand's definitely a rational. She's in Aristotle's camp. The tradition of the West is more Aristotelian than it is Platonic. But he was kind of a theologian and a metaphysicist, meaning that he believed in something higher than human life, something spiritual, something that moved within us, a soul, those kinds of ideas. So they're talking and talking, and Ayn is like, or Anne, I really am not absolutely sure. I've heard it so many different times by so many different people. He was a utilitarian, she an advocate of self-interest. They discussed politics. He was a socialist, she an advocate of capitalism. At dawn, as the professor and I left, he said to me, clearly distressed, she's found gaping holes in every philosophical position I've maintained for the whole of my life. Positions I teach to my students, positions on which I'm a recognized authority, and I can't answer her arguments. I don't know what to do. He found a solution. He refused to see Ayn again, and he went on maintaining his former views. She was absolutely brilliant at reasoning, and she did this a lot. Later in her life, when she came to know Barbara, she was already in her 50s. She was already an accomplished author, already published and famous. And her reasoning skills just became more and more perfected later on in life as she gained an education. She was very self-educated in the classics, very driven to know things. She could make all kinds of profound connections between different philosophers. She could, when she first read Nietzsche, she thought that she was in his camp and that they had a lot of common, and then she said she came to hate him. She professed later on that Aristotle was the only philosopher that had any profound effect on her that she ever learned from, but certainly she honed her reasoning skills from her education. Because reason trumped everything for her, it got to the point where she kind of became a law to herself. Now, The Virtue of Selfishness is very worth reading. After she goes along, she publishes We the Living, and then she publishes Fountainhead, and that's where Barbara and Nathaniel come from. She's having a lot of success. She spends, she's a full-time author. She writes and writes and writes and writes. I looked it up again. If I'm remembering correctly, when she wrote Galt's speech for Atlas Shrugged, I think it took her 2 years to write. She thought it would take her a couple months. But that's writing 40 hours a week or more. And then she would have these people over to her home because she loved to apartment. She loved to hash things out. She loved intellectual discussions. It was a highlight of her life. And so these people would come to her home, just like this professor, and they would stay all night and talk about everything. And she was brilliant, and she would impress people, and they would walk away just, and she would have staunch followers. Now, she was, for most purposes, an Austrian school economist, and she and Mises became friends. Mises once gave her a compliment. He said, she's the most brilliant man I've ever met. She was delighted by that compliment because she loved her intellect, and she loved that he found her equal intellectually with all the other men that he knew. They did end up having a falling out, but the truth is she ended up having a falling out with almost everyone that she knew. By the end of her life, she was almost friendless, and her marriage was a complete wreck. So she became more and more isolated as her life went on. So she's going along, she's having this success. There's some cool stories in the book about how Fountainhead came to be published, and the editor that really, or agent that really believed in her and pushed for the publication. And there's some cool stories about that. And she was really, the thing that's one of the most amazing things to me about her is that she's publishing some of the most popular books from the 20th century in her secondary language. That is absolutely unbelievable to me. No other author has done that. She wrote these books in English. She mastered the English language to that degree. And I'm the first one to say that there are many things that Rand taught that I absolutely 100% spot on with her. And she's fascinating to study because one minute we're totally unified and I'm with her and I absolutely agree, and then I absolutely disagree the next minute. But there are some things that she may sway you on because she is so brilliant, and just look carefully at where she's on principle and where she's not. There's some great articles in The Virtue of Selfishness about prejudice, about black and white and grays and absolutes. She believed in absolutes. I want to read this other thing that Barbara wrote here in this prologue about her, because it says a lot about her. She says for Rand, she would either say I value or I despise. She was a very black and white thinker. She came to be, and that's what some of those articles are about, how there are absolutes. And you know, here's the thing. One of the reasons why she took such a hold on young adults in her day and since is because, and I talk about this in other places and in our organizations and our intensives and all that kind of thing. But as young adults, as you begin to think abstractly in your youth years, one of the most important things that everyone needs to know is that that's when you develop those abstract thinking skills. What youth and young adults are looking for is principles. They want to know how to build a life. They want to know what concepts they should hang on to, what values they should adhere to, and what principles should guide their lives. And she gave young adults absolutes in an age of relativism. And she made brilliant intellectual arguments for them. And that's why they just worshipped her. And that's why Objectivism and her books became a religion for many young adults. That's why Nathaniel and Barbara followed her, did everything, believed. She was just able to talk them into anything, into believing anything that she said, because she was so brilliant and so persuasive, because her reasoning skills and her intellect were unbelievable. The problem was she wasn't always principle-based. When it comes to government and economics, she is almost always absolutely spot on. And that's where she was best educated. That's where she had the most life experience. And that's why her books resonate with people, because it shows how government intervention actually destroys an economy and how interlinked they are. But she had this big beef about what's it called? Altruism. So for her, being altruistic meant that you would claim that you did something wholly for somebody else's benefit and you didn't benefit by it at all. And she detested altruism. And she felt that every religion that ever existed was founded on the principle of altruism. And she felt it was a false principle, and that self-interest, or what she calls selfishness, and she does that largely to get under people's skin and to get readership. But she felt this self-interest, and the founders called it enlightened self-interest, and you can find it in their writings, and it is a concept, it is a principle, and it drives capitalism, and it drives free economies. And the Austrian school is all about that, and so that's where she and Mises were really in harmony there. But she just said, you have to let people do things that benefit them, and that's the only way they can lead happy lives. And so she took that economic principle and she put it in every other area of life. That's why she despised religion. That's why she consciously and purposely put a name to a worldview, and she called it a worldview, and she taught it as a worldview. They started a newsletter. So So she publishes Fountainhead. Nathaniel and Barbara find her as college students. They're absolutely enamored with her. They come visit her all the time. She takes them under her wing. She tutors them in her philosophy, and Nathaniel is brilliant. And so he helps start up a newsletter, and he writes and she writes. And so you'll find in The Virtue of Selfishness that they're both writing. There's articles from both of them. It was during this time period. She's in the middle of writing Atlas Shrugged. She's writing like crazy and then reading excerpts to this group of friends. They're half her age, okay? She's in her 50s, they're in their 20s. She's spending all her time with these young people. Her and Frank are already kind of, I don't know that they ever really argued, but Frank just always gave in, gave in, gave in. He was became a very weak man, and Rand was so strong, so opinionated, so concrete in everything that she was about. She just kind of, the people around her came to kind of believe that she just didn't see Frank, like that she had created this husband in her head that he wasn't really, and that she would talk about him in terms that everybody's like, who are you talking about? That's not even what Frank is like. So she kind of lived in a la-la land as far as her marriage is concerned. So they're going along. Nathaniel and Barbara get married. And over the next little while, Nathaniel and Rand have these series of conversations where they discover that they are in love with each other. Nathaniel doesn't really know how he feels about her. He's not really attracted to her, but he's enamored by her. And so they develop this whole theory, and one of the articles in The Virtue of Selfishness talks about this idea that you are sexually attracted to the people who are your intellectual equals, and you need to give way to that. That's why Dagny is her. She says over and over again, there's quotes all over the place about how I am Dagny. And the Dagny's sexual exploits are kind of Rand living out her fantasies of the very greatest men that she idolized and were her heroes wanting her, and they would want her because they would want her because of who she was intellectually. And so she and Nathaniel sit Barbara and Frank down, and they have these, I can't remember how many weeks or maybe a couple months it was, that almost nightly they met, and late into the night, Nathaniel and Rand, but especially Rand, would get all the intellectual arguments about why they should allow her and Nathaniel to have this affair. And it was heart-wrenching for Barbara and Frank. They didn't understand it. Rand was dominant in all of the relationships. They didn't know how to deal with it. They could tell she wasn't going to give in and she wasn't going to stop. Frank wasn't going to divorce her. Barbara, didn't mind as much as Frank, but the whole thing was just confusing. They were young. So they began this affair, and Frank would leave the apartment and they would have relations, and this went on for a period of time, and eventually Nathaniel ended up having a relationship with a third woman that Barbara was aware of, but they hid from Rand. And so when she found out about it, because for her it was okay if you could reason it out, and it was okay if everybody knew. She was all about just being all honest, and she didn't want other people to know. Like, she kind of hid it from the world and from their following, but their spouses knew, and their spouses had agreed, and so they had this affair, and that's mostly what the movie is about. And so anyway, this goes on. She finds out, she wipes out the newsletter, she extricates them from her life, she's bitter, she's angry, the movement kind of falls apart, and she lives out the rest of her life pretty much alone. She begins to hate people that she's been close to in the past. She closes off from them. She loses most of her relationships. In the meantime, Frank has become a really heavy alcoholic. I think it was him that developed cancer and died, or he died and then she developed cancer. But the end of her life is really kind of sad and lonely. She was given some awards and she did some speaking, but for as far as her personal life was concerned, it was very lonely and sad. So she is a fascinating individual. She has a lot of truth, and then in her personal life, in my opinion, this is kind of my summing up Ayn Rand in my mind. She adhered to principles in some areas of her life, and she completely ignored other principles. Because reason was her core value and virtue, because reason trumped everything else, she became unable to listen to anyone else's input. And Barbara does emphasize over and over again, and she quotes other people about how prideful Rand became, how nobody could ever give her any advice. They never had anything of value to teach her or to say to her, because she became so convinced of the implacability, the infallibility of her own reason, and she trusted it implicitly. And because she was kind of that law unto herself, because she would not listen to anyone, even the people that were close to her, she lost all those relationships. And she gained the fame. And it wasn't about fame for her. She genuinely, and in many ways, was a very good woman in the sense that she really always adhered to the virtues and the principles that she taught. But the whole in her story is that if you were to follow her worldview implicitly in the way that she did, you would probably have about the same results that she did. Your personal life would probably fall apart. Many things in your life would fall apart as you followed your own reason at the expense of everything else. So she is really worth reading about, worth studying, worth discussing. I have some of my favorite articles from The Virtue of Selfishness, and I'll blog on that another day and tell you what some of those are. The Passion of Ayn Rand, it would really be, and discussing a great book club discussion book, probably, this biography of her. You'll learn a lot about the background of how the books came out and about her worldview, Objectivism, and about the people that she knew. And I think you'll learn a lot about relationships and about maybe, you know, what you're about in your own worldview. It's one of those books that forces you to kind of think, well, what am I about then? What are my core values that are leading me to certain assumptions that are causing certain behaviors in my life? And I'm getting these results, and I'm looking all around me at the results, and maybe I like them and maybe I don't like them, and so maybe I need to reevaluate what I'm about. Anyway, that was long, I'm sorry, but there's a lot to say about her. I haven't said everything I think or everything I've read, but I think it's valuable for you, for your education, from the standpoint of worldviews. I definitely, when we do worldviews with students in intensives, definitely read some stuff about Rand and talk about libertarianism and talk about what she's about, because it's important. And it's having influence into the 21st century, so it's also very important to know. And it's important to know as mothers and as parents, as educators, whatever your role, to teach these concepts to the rising generation. So, if this was helpful, please pass it on to a friend and like us on Facebook, join our email list, and we will see you next time.